Let's start with Wolfenstein 2: The New Colossus. Now, this is a game that doesn't hold back. From the moment you start, it's full throttle, no apologies. The story picks up right after the first one, and let me tell you, they dive straight into the madness. You've got BJ Blazkowicz, still the ultimate Nazi killing machine, but now even more battle-worn and broken, both physically and mentally. And yet, he's still got that fire. He's out for blood, but there's this deeper emotional side to him in this game that really surprised me. The gunplay is pure chaos in the best way. The weapons are so satisfying, and when you dual-wield two massive guns, it's like you're a one-man army mowing down everything in your path. The combat is fast, brutal, and it just feels good. Every shot has impact. And the enemies don't just drop. They explode into chunks when you hit them right. It's gloriously over the top, and I loved every second of it. Oh, and let's talk about the villains. Frau Engel, she's terrifying. She's not just some generic evil figure. She's genuinely unsettling, with this twisted obsession and cruelty that makes her a perfect antagonist. You really want to take her down, and that's what drives you forward. The way the game builds tension between you and her is brilliant, and every time she shows up, you know things are about to get wild. The characters are fantastic. Whether it's old friends from the Resistance or new allies you meet along the way, everyone's got their own personality, and it makes you care about them. Some scenes had me laughing, others had me really thinking, and a few hit me harder than I expected. Next, we have Warhammer Space Marine 2. Honestly, I had pretty high expectations going in, especially since I loved the first game, but this one really blew me away. I just finished it, and I'm still buzzing with adrenaline. If you're into anything Warhammer or just a fan of solid, brutal action games, this one hits all the right notes. Right from the start, I was hooked. You jump back into the boots of Captain Titus, and let me tell you, they've cranked everything up. Titus feels like an absolute force of nature, and the game really nails that power fantasy of being a space marine. Every time I smashed into a group of Tyranids, it felt like I was carving through them like a god of war. And these Tyranids are terrifying. The way they swarm you, it's a mix of pure chaos and strategic survival. Speaking of strategy, the game's combat is deeper than it looks at first. Sure, you can charge in swinging that chainsword and ripping through enemies, but you've got to think a bit too. You can't just button mash your way to victory, especially with those massive bosses. They've got these intricate patterns, so it feels like a dance between brute force and tactical moves. When I finally took down one of the bigger enemies after like 15 minutes of dodging and countering, it was such a satisfying moment. I felt like I earned that victory. And the story is more than just a mindless shooter, that's for sure. There are moments where the weight of war, the cost of being a space marine, really hit. Titus's arc feels more fleshed out this time around. He's not just a badass in power armor, but a character you actually care about. Next we have Bloodborne. It absolutely deserved to win Game of the Year in 2015, but didn't quite get the crown. I mean, this game was From Software at its peak, delivering an intense Gothic nightmare of a world that fans still rave about to this day. It's wild to think that something this groundbreaking didn't take home the big award. First off, the atmosphere in Bloodborne? Unreal. Yharnam was this dark, twisted Victorian city filled with werewolves, cosmic horrors, and nightmare creatures that just kept you on edge the entire time. The design of the world was so hauntingly beautiful, with that classic From Software touch, where every alley and hidden path had a story to tell. The game didn't hold your hand either, which was part of its charm. You had to figure everything out on your own, from the lore to the mechanics. And let's talk about that combat system. Bloodborne took the typical slow, methodical Souls formula and made it fast and aggressive. You couldn't just hang back and wait. The game literally rewarded you for going on the offense with that regain system. If you got hit, you had a window to hit back and regain your health, which encouraged players to stay in the fight instead of running away. It was like Dark Souls on adrenaline. But here's the thing, Bloodborne came out the same year as The Witcher 3, Wild Hunt, and that's where things get tricky. The Witcher 3 swept most of the awards that year, and while it was undoubtedly a great game, a lot of people felt like Bloodborne was overshadowed because of that. But for those who played it, Bloodborne was a masterpiece. Next we have Watch Dogs 2. This one is so different from the first game, in a good way. I remember being kind of underwhelmed with the original Watch Dogs. Aiden Pierce, the protagonist, felt a bit too broody. And while the hacking mechanics were fun, the game just didn't have that spark. Watch Dogs 2, though? Completely different vibe. First of all, Marcus Holloway, the main character, is such a breath of fresh air. He's charismatic, funny, and feels like a real person you'd want to hang out with. And his crew? The whole DedSec team is just this cool group of misfits, and they have this energy that's contagious. You can tell they actually care about what they're doing, which makes all those missions feel more personal. Speaking of missions, the open world in San Francisco is incredible. It's not just bigger than the original, but way more vibrant. You know how some open world games feel like they're just there to fill space? Not here. There's always something cool happening, whether it's a random NPC having a funny conversation, or some kind of crazy car chase happening right down the street. And let's talk about the hacking for a second. This time around, it's not just about pressing a button to hack a camera. You can control cars, drones, even giant construction cranes. There were so many moments where I just sat back and thought, I can actually do this in a game? It feels so rewarding to get creative with it. Like, I once completed a mission without stepping foot inside the building. I hacked everything remotely using my drone and RC car. One thing I wasn't expecting was how much I'd enjoy just exploring the city. Next we have Resident Evil Village, another game that could have easily taken the Game of the Year title, but somehow didn't. And honestly, that's kind of surprising because when Village dropped, it felt like Capcom had found the perfect balance between horror, action, and just downright weirdness. One of the standout things about Resident Evil Village was how it mixed elements from both Resident Evil 7 and the more action-heavy style of Resident Evil 4. You had the creepy, atmospheric horror from 7, but then they threw in these larger-than-life characters and set pieces that screamed RE4, Lady Dimitrescu. Instantly iconic. She had the internet buzzing for months before the game even came out, and her castle felt like this throwback to the Gothic vibes of older Resident Evil games. But what made Village special was how it didn't stick to just one type of horror. Each section of the game felt different. You had survival horror with limited resources in some areas, and then you'd go into full-on action mode with tons of firepower in others. And let's not forget the Beneviento house. That whole part was straight-up nightmare fuel. It felt like Capcom was experimenting with different horror subgenres, and for the most part, it totally worked. There was also the story. Resident Evil games have always been known for their over-the-top plots, and Village didn't disappoint in that regard. 2021 was a tough year for competition. It Takes Two ended up winning Game of the Year, and while it's a great game, it's a totally different vibe. Next we have Infamous Second Son. It's such a great pick when looking back at favorite games, especially after all these years. It's one of those games that might not always get mentioned in the big best-of-all-time list, but for those who played it, it really leaves a lasting impression. The game came out as one of the earlier titles for the PS4, and honestly, it still holds up really well. You step into the shoes of Delson Rowe, a rebellious guy who suddenly gets these insane superpowers. What I love about the game is how good it feels to actually use those powers. Whether you're running up buildings, gliding through the air, or just wrecking shop with your abilities, the movement and action feel super smooth and fun. The game absolutely nails that sense of power, which, let's face it, is what we're all here for in a superhero-style game. Seattle is the backdrop for all the action, and they did such a good job with the city's vibe. It's not a carbon copy of the real Seattle, but it's got enough personality to feel alive, and the way the environment changes based on your actions is a nice touch. That whole dynamic, where your choices matter, whether you want to be a hero or lean into a more destructive, rebellious path, adds a layer of replayability. And honestly, both paths are equally fun. Infamous Second Son really nails that feeling of freedom, and the pacing keeps you engaged from start to finish. It's one of those games where you can easily lose hours just exploring, testing out your powers, and getting into epic showdowns with the game's enemies. And even though it's been a while since it first dropped, it's still a total blast to revisit. Next we have The Order 1886. I know it got mixed reviews when it came out, but honestly I think it's super underrated. It's like every single thing from the cobblestone streets to the smoke-filled taverns feels alive. You can really see how much love went into building that world. The steampunk vibe is also really cool. You've got this mix of old-school Victorian aesthetic with futuristic tech, like those crazy weapons that Nikola Tesla himself designed. The thermite rifle, for example, is just so satisfying to use. You shoot clouds of thermite at enemies, and then light it up with a flare, setting everything ablaze. It's so over the top, but in the best way possible. And the story? It's actually pretty engaging. You're part of this ancient order of knights tasked with keeping the peace in London, But things get real complicated, especially with the introduction of half-breeds, like werewolves, and other supernatural threats. Plus, the way it blends history with fantasy, that was a fun twist for me. Sir Galahad, the main character, has this gruff, no-nonsense attitude that really pulls you into the whole mystery and intrigue of the game. I liked how he's conflicted, dealing with betrayal and questioning everything around him. It gave the game more emotional depth than I expected. The gunplay is solid too. It's not a massive open-world shooter, but for a more linear experience, the mechanics work great. Each weapon feels unique, and the cover system is smooth. And those cinematic quick-time events, I know some people aren't fans of QTEs, but here they blend so well with the action. It feels more like you're playing through a movie. Next we have Death Stranding, one of the most divisive games out there. When this game dropped, it was like half the gaming community loved it, and the other half was just like, what is this? It's a Hideo Kojima game, so you know it was going to be unique. But Death Stranding took that to a whole new level. Instead of fast-paced action or combat-heavy gameplay, you're a delivery guy in a post-apocalyptic world. It's a game about walking, hiking, and, yes, carrying boxes. People were super confused by the whole concept, especially because the marketing was so mysterious. The trailers didn't really explain much. And when players realized they'd be spending a lot of time delivering packages across desolate landscapes, some were disappointed. It wasn't the action-packed game people expected from the creator of Metal Gear Solid. But here's where the game shines. Death Stranding isn't trying to be a traditional game. It's about the journey, the connections you make, and the feeling of isolation in a broken world. And if you get into that mindset, the game is really something special. It's strangely relaxing, even though it has some seriously intense moments. The way it handles the idea of connecting players, allowing you to help out others in the world by leaving equipment or building structures, was pretty innovative. It made the world feel shared, even though it's a single-player game. Sure, it's not for everyone. If you're looking for constant action, Death Stranding might not be your cup of tea, but if you're in the mood for something different, something that really takes its time to build atmosphere, it's a game that delivers a unique experience. Next, we have Baldur's Gate 3. If you're into RPGs or Dungeons & Dragons, this is basically a dream come true. The thing is, it's not just the story. It's the choices you make, the characters you meet, the dice rolls that can completely change how a situation unfolds. Every playthrough feels different, and I love that about it. First off, let's talk about the freedom this game gives you. You can literally do anything. Want to sneak past enemies instead of fighting them? Go for it. Want to convince a dragon to let you pass with just a bit of clever dialogue? Roll those dice. Or if you're feeling chaotic, you can just, blow stuff up with magic and hope for the best. That freedom makes every encounter feel fresh, and it's not just about combat. Your decisions can have lasting consequences on the story, on your companions, and even on the world itself. The story itself is wild. You start off with this mind flayer parasite in your brain, which immediately sets the stakes super high. And as you try to find a cure, you uncover all these other crazy plots and factions vying for control. It's dark, it's epic, and the world is full of so many cool little stories and side quests that it's easy to get lost in it all. The best part? You can shape the story in so many different ways, whether you want to be a hero, a villain, or something in between. The game doesn't force you down one path. It really feels like your journey. It's got that perfect blend of story, character development, and strategic combat, all wrapped up in this beautiful, sprawling world. Next we have Kena Bridge of Spirits. From the moment I started playing, I was just blown away by how stunning everything looked. It's like stepping into a Pixar movie, but you're in control. The art style is so vibrant and colorful, and the way they bring this magical world to life is just mesmerizing. Every detail feels like it was handcrafted with so much love, from the lush forests to the little creatures, the rot. I mean, those rot are just adorable, right? They're like these little black, fluffy creatures that follow you around, and they're not only cute, they're super helpful too. The gameplay, though, man, that's where it gets really fun. It's got that action-adventure feel, with some Zelda-like puzzle-solving and exploration. The combat is super smooth, and the combination of your staff attacks and the rot helping you out is such a cool mechanic. I loved how you can use the rot to distract enemies or empower your attacks. And the way the game gradually gives you new abilities keeps things fresh. Plus, those boss fights, some of them are tough, like way tougher than I expected. They really make you strategize, which is a nice surprise in a game that looks so cozy on the surface. And speaking of cozy, the world is just so nice to explore. The puzzles are really well designed too, not too hard, but they make you feel smart when you solve them. I remember one where you had to use the rot to move objects around and align things just right, and it was just the perfect balance of challenge and satisfaction.